I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast Supplement. Rob.
Yo.
What are we looking at today?
A Snoopy comic.
Oh.
We're not actually looking at a Snoopy comic, but that just seemed like
Aren't
really
we doing
great.
Rana Mitter's China's Good War?
I wanted to do Snoopy. You went with Rana Mitter, so I guess we'll talk about Rana Mitter.
I always win in the end.
You do.
This is a really fascinating book, China's Good War by Rana Mitter, that came out in the last year, I think.
It's relatively new, yeah.
It's 2020 or 2021. I don't even actually know. But it's a fascinating look at how the meaning of World War II has evolved more in China than it has for any other nation that was involved in World War II in a fairly major way. And Rana Mitter is a scholar who has explored the meaning of World War II in China for pretty much his entire career. He comes up with some great stuff here. He's looking at how that comes out in film, in literature, and in museums, which is my bread and butter. But Rob, what did you think about his argument?
I thought it was fascinating. I was trying to place this in terms of what I feel like is a resurgence in U.S. cinema in particular with World War II. I remember there not being that many films about World War II, and then it seemed like all of a sudden there was just tons of them. Saving Private Ryan, Pearl Harbor, the Band of Brothers. There's tons of stuff on World War II. It just keeps coming back and coming back. And I was thinking, well, are they rewriting it? Is it something different? And it's actually just a grittier, darker look at the heroes of World War II that we had before. I mean, it's not substantially different from any of the films made before them, really, in terms of us versus the Nazis, good guys win, bad guys lose. They find a little nuance. Some of the characters are really occasionally bad people and stuff, but you still have this underlying narrative that's still the same. China is not. Fairly obvious reasons. After 1949, the communists are not particularly interested in a us versus the Japanese or us versus something or other. The glorious story is the founding of the People's Republic of China, right?
It's kind of weird to think that for the first 3 decades of the existence of the PRC, that not that there was no discussion of World War II and China's role in it, because there was, but it was just super limited. Like they didn't talk about it in literature that much. It really wasn't a big thing. The big thing that was discussed in literature and in film was always the CCP versus the KMT, that fight.
Which is the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang.
Right. Mao didn't really want to talk about the war with Japan. It didn't do that much for him ideologically. And that's Rana Mitter's argument, is that now, starting in the 1980s, you start to see this resurgence of discussions of World War II while also seeing this resurgence of nationalism. And the reason that China is increasingly discussing World War II, even as it gets farther and farther into the past, it has nothing to do with the war. China frequently has protest against the Japanese. But he makes the point, it's not about Japan. It's really about China and constructing an identity for the Chinese people because, in the so-called century of humiliation, it's mostly Chinese people fighting Chinese people. The colonizers come in and they're doing stuff, but there's a lot of brother-on-brother action. It's really hard to construct a good national narrative that kind of gets people to rally around the flag if it's not us versus them. The thing that makes World War II so incredible for Chinese propagandists is that it is this us versus them. And it's a very clear-cut thing. But I like how Rana Mitter kind of takes us through this point where nobody was talking about this war in China, and now everybody is. And the point that he makes is that it allows the CCP to construct this nationalism within China. But he also makes this point, and I'm a little bit less convinced by this point, but I think he's right, but I think he makes the case too strongly, that China is seeking a role as a dominant power in contemporary politics, and it's using its involvement in World War II as a kind of ideological foundation for that. Whereas, with Mao, he didn't really care because it was all about revolution.
Well, and I see his point in that really World War II is still that's the thing on which we construct most of the modern world we live in. I mean, whenever you talk to anyone who is beating the war drum about America first, we're a special country, we should lead the world and all that, always look back to World War II. Always, 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 always.
To be fair, I mean, in Britain, they do the same thing.
Every country has some version of it. But that was my point, is that China's looking around at all this.
Not Germany.
Well, maybe not Germany. That's probably true, yes. All the winning countries, anyway.
And that's an important qualifier.
Yes.
All the winning countries.
Exactly. I was just going to go there, which is China's looking at these big countries, U.S., Britain, to some extent France. France is not particularly nostalgic about World War II.
France is kind of funky.
But there's a reason that Charles de Gaulle is such a hero. It's because he, like a little bit like Mao in some ways, is one of the few who went, no, we need to fight. I don't care what they're doing, we need to fight, right?
I'm glad you compared Charles de Gaulle to Mao.
We just lost all our French listeners.
Sacre bleu.
And I know, but that brings up another point that he makes I want to hit on just a second. But first, that China knows that this is the thing that qualifies you as the good guys and as the world powers. One of the things is you fought evil and you won. So they got to be a part of the dance, right? Somehow, right? So that's one thing. Second, the case of Mao Zedong and his Eighth Root Army in particular is an interesting one because at the time, that was the only real Chinese force that was actively fighting the Japanese. And we're not talking about winning major victories and kicking the Japanese out, but at least being an annoyance enough.
So there's actually a huge debate over how much Mao did to actually fight the Japanese. And, this is a historical debate, and we don't really need to take side. I mean, we're not historians. What I think is interesting is just the change. The CCP has to acknowledge that the KMT was a legitimate ruler of China for them to make this argument, for them to say China was there in 1945, we defeated the Japanese. Previously, Mao and others in the CCP had just kind of ignored that history. Now, under a nationalist China, and this was happening before Xi Jinping, this is happening as early as the 1980s, is a point Rana Mitter makes, is that as China becomes more nationalist, they become more focused on utilizing memory of World War II to their advantage, which kind of makes them shift ideologically, because previously you weren't able to talk about the KMT. The KMT were the bad guys. But now it's okay, and you have all these films. You have, I'm thinking of Moyan's Red Sorghum, that is showing folks in the KMT, at least in like a sort of positive light.
They're Chinese. This is the point. They're now Chinese.
And so it's a nationalist argument,
Right,
whereas
right.
before it wasn't politically driven ideology. I guess they're both political, but it was a party-driven ideology.
Well, what's interesting, another interesting thing about all this, though, is what it says about the role World War II plays in all constructions of what it means to be a world power today. That China would even feel it necessary to go this direction points to just how potent this narrative is in the United States in particular, but as you mentioned, Great Britain as well. There's an argument to be made for U.S. identity as we know it today being constructed, at least in good part, on World War II. This continuing belief that it's us versus the forces of evil. Not for everyone, obviously. There's tons of people in the U.S. who don't think this. But this is still enough of a national narrative that other countries like China are like, hey, where do we fit in with this? And if we want to be taken seriously, enough people buy into this narrative, enough people stand on this narrative that we got to have our place in it.
Russia has tried to do this again and again. I mean, they construct national identity out of the 20 million victims of World War II, and that's played a huge role in the ideology that has gone to work in Ukraine and Russia's conflict with Ukraine. We're trying to be as apolitical as possible here. And I think that China is kind of taking its cues as much from Russia as it is from the U.S. But this is a fascinating read. Definitely give it a look if you're interested. We'll put it on the podcast website, and you can, if you like, you can order it via our website, which we're supposed to, according to Amazon, say we may be able to get a commission off of this. But yeah, I thought this book was really well done, especially for someone who's interested in Chinese literature, Chinese film, seeing how those ideological claims shifted in film and a couple of literary sources.
Agreed. So we're going to wrap this up here, but make sure you look us up, Twitter, Instagram, email Chinese.
Email us, please.
Yeah, please. We love getting emails
Yeah.
from people. Anyone will tell
we
you.
sometimes are in dissertation, so we might not get back to you. I'm sorry.
HE double hockey sticks.
We sometimes are in dissertation HE double hockey stick.
Indeed. Although, mine's almost done. Woo-hoo. Anyway. Yeah, send us an email, ChineseLiteraturepodcast@gmail.com, ChinLitPod on Twitter, ChineseLitPod on Instagram, and as always, send us beer money through Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.